there was a liberal strand, a humanitarian strand, and the other thing is the empire learned from its mistakes. So that's why I think the way in which the empire exhausted itself in the Second World War is a kind of, says a lot. That the way the empire died, or exhausted itself before it died, was to spend itself fighting Nazism.
Hello and welcome to the Aspects of History podcast. My name is Oliver Webb-Carter and I'm the editor and your host. Now, it's been brought to my attention that I have a number of new listeners, so I say to you, welcome. It's fantastic to have you join. Well done, top marks from me. In this pod, you'll find plenty of varied content and guests, from ancient history to the relatively recent past, from historians to historical fiction authors, and from polemics on the West today to historical myth-busting. Today's episode is one that I was trying to arrange a bit last minute, so I haven't managed to trail, but it's with Nigel Biggar, who is the author of a new book, Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning. This title has just come out and has been doing very well, so there's clearly an interest in the subject, and so I wanted to get him on the pod to discuss it. Now, Nigel is considered by some to be a controversial fellow, but I have to say, having read his book, I was quite surprised by that, because it seemed quite a grounded and balanced take on the empire. So by that, he deals with both the terrible actions of British colonialists head on, but he also looks at parts of the empire that were beneficial, and which you heard him talk about at the top there. As some of you may know from our recent chat with Saul David on the Anglo-Zulu War, empire was not necessarily as simple as one thinks, so I hope we deal with those complexities in today's chat. Some of what you hear you may wish to comment on, so by all means get in touch with me. I'd be happy to hear from you, and you'll find links in the show notes. In the meantime, thank you very much for listening. Please do subscribe and rate and review if you can, and I'll hand you over to me talking with Professor Nigel Biggar. Nigel Biggar, welcome. It's a real pleasure to have you on. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you, Oliver. My pleasure to be here.
Well, I've been very keen to speak to you because your latest book, or your new book, Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning, which has come out just about 2 or 3 weeks ago, has been doing very well. And I wanted to speak to you really because it's an unusual, well, I don't know how unusual it is. I don't know how many books there are like this. I don't think there are many that give a moral reckoning of colonialism in the British Empire. And I've read it and I found it fascinating, and I've really enjoyed it. And what I wanted to speak to you about really was that this, and we're going to get on to it, the books had a difficult birth, and I'm very keen to speak to you about that. And I would say that some people might describe this book as controversial, but when I was reading the book, I couldn't understand what all the fuss was about. And that's not to say I'm saying that because the book wasn't interesting to me. It was. It's more the fact that I was expecting to find things a little bit more controversial than they really are, because you give a very balanced view of both positive and negative of empire, particularly the British Empire.
Yes. That's an interesting reaction of yours, Oliver, and it says a lot, because the truth is, what you read is the kind of stuff I write. I'm not a natural controversialist. I don't actually seek to be provocative. I'm cautious and I'm careful, and I try and anticipate all sides of an argument and navigate my way argumentatively toward a conclusion, and I'm willing to state definite conclusions that I'm sure some people will disagree with strongly, but that's always been my approach. But so hence my complete bewilderment when 5 years ago I just published an article in the London Times making what I thought was a completely anodyne point, although I think it's a true one, that we British can find cause for both shame and pride in our imperial past. And I just launched a project called Ethics and Empire a few months before that. And that's when Prem Gopal from Cambridge University tweeted to her political allies in Oxford oh my God, this is serious, SHIT, we must, block capitals, shut this down. But my point is this, that my moderate, balanced point of view nevertheless provoked such a severe reaction on the part of some on the left.
And so this ethics course that you started, I guess, and the reaction to it, I suppose, is partly the reason why it was difficult with your first publisher to get the book published. And this is a very interesting story that I thought the listeners would certainly be interested in, because this is my role as an editor. I find this quite disturbing in that this book, you had a deal with your first publisher, but that then was effectively cancelled.
Yes, just to be clear about this project I referred to, it was called Ethics and Empire. We launched it in July 17, and it was conceived with me by probably the most eminent historian of empire writing in English, John Darwin. And it's not designed as a defense of British Empire or even of empire. It's designed to look at how late Romans or ancient Chinese viewed the empire of their day in moral terms. So how did they assess empire? So that was that project, and that is what sparked, I think, the strong reaction from some parts of the left that I got. But I survived the turmoil of December 2017. In early 2018, Robin Baird Smith from Bloomsbury Publishing approached me, suggested I write a book on colonialism. Eventually I agreed, signed a contract, and produced the manuscript at the end of 2020. I was due to present the manuscript by 31st of December 2020. I did so at 3 p.m. on that day with a whole 9 hours to spare.
That's very unlike an academic, isn't it? That's the students meant to be doing that.
Yes, I know. My recent experience of essay crisis. Yes, I like to live dangerously, clearly. So Robin read the manuscript, and he wrote back, to my great pleasure. He said, I'm speechless, he said, with regard to the quality of the writing and the rigor of the research. And he said, it's an important book, and he predicted sales of between 15 and 20,000 copies. And so he put it into the copy editing process at Bloomsbury. They even produced a book cover. But 3 months later, in the middle of March, I got an email from the top of Bloomsbury announcing that they were postponing publication indefinitely because, quote, public feeling is unfavorable. And I was shocked and depressed. But I decided, and I was told that in fact they wanted me to walk away from the contract, but I wasn't willing to let them go that easily. So I engaged them in correspondence, trying to get them to commit to paper just what was the real reason for their reaction. And I asked them, innocently, so which public feeling are you referring to? There being more than one public feeling. And I asked them under what conditions would publication become possible again, and they declined to answer. And in April, I got a letter saying, we're sure you're impatient to get this published, so we're not going to send your contract back to you. Now they claim that I walked away from it. That's not true, because I then went to spend several £100 on a lawyer to find out whether I could hold them to my contract, and discovered that due to a clause I couldn't. And then later in April, I let Bloomsbury know exactly what I thought about what they'd done. And most of all, apart from personal distress, what distressed me was the thought that we in Britain have come to the place where mainstream publishers will not publish good quality work on important topics just because some people might be upset. And I was told that the problem was that some junior colleagues in Bloomsbury had protested about handling my material. Again, they deny that, but I have to say it's the only plausible explanation that's left standing right now. Well,
if that really is true, it's one wonders if they'd even read the manuscript, and it's pleasing to know that it was then picked up by HarperCollins, who've now published it, and it's doing very well.
Yes, it is, and I because I'm not a professional historian, I anticipated the usual line of criticism that's come along, namely that Biggar has no standing as an historian to talk about these things. It's only professional historians who have the right, apparently. So I took care to solicit pre-publication commendations from about 10 or 11, mostly historians, with one journalist, Matthew Paris. And I was delighted that many of them use the words balanced, fair, rigorous in describing the book. To be plausible to a reasonable reader, I had to be that, because you know, if I'd written a book that said that the British Empire was nothing but sweet reason and good stuff, it would not have been plausible. Apart from not being true, it just wouldn't be plausible. So I had to look at the bad bits, of which there are very bad bits, in the face, and nevertheless come to a judgment. That's what I try to do.
Well, perhaps we can talk about some of those. The book itself is, as I say, to me it is balanced, and you know, as we say, as I've just mentioned, that you know there are bad sides to it, but also, you know, there are some more positive elements. But I was wondering, you've talked about the Chinese Empire at the beginning of this conversation, and I've studied ancient history, and that, you know, empire, the very nature of empire is that it is, because it subjugates weaker, in inverted commas, civilizations or tribes or groups or whatever you want to call it, inevitably there will be a clash, and there will be a loser. And do you think that the reason why it's so emotive to talk about, because it's just a little bit more recent? I mean, the empire, probably end of World War One is end of Second World War, I know, is sort of almost officially when India gains independence in 1947, is often described as the end of the British Empire. But do you think that's why it's so emotive, because it's more recent?
So there are two questions you raised. First of all, about the nature of empires in general, and you talked about subjugation, and I think actually as a general description of empire, that's not accurate. Certainly it's a feature of empire that one people dominates another. Subjugation is not always the case. Sometimes certain peoples prefer to be dominated by another people. So for example, late 1950s, early 1960s, several million Chinese opt to leave the Chinese mainland to enter the British colony of Hong Kong, which, while not democratic, offered the rule of law and stability, which was not present on the Chinese mainland. So they opted, in a sense, to be dominated by British rule. But even then, even though it wasn't democratic, I mean, British rule in Hong Kong or elsewhere could not have survived. I mean, no rule can survive which pays no attention to the people it rules, because it will soon provoke resentment and rebellion. And the numbers of British government officials and British troops and British merchants in most of the colonies was tiny. And there, at one point, I quote this in the book, I think one viceroy of India said, if every black man picks up a grain of sand and chucks it at us, we're going to be buried. So I think to characterize empire or colonialism in general as subjugation is a mistake. It's much more subtle than that. So that was on one point to raise. So the other one was, yes, why the focus on British Empire? Well, I think the focus is on European empires, and I'll include in that American empire. And it's a very interesting question, why it is that no one cares about the ancient empires of the Middle East, for example, or the Zulu Empire of the 1820s, or the Comanche Empire of the 1700s, or Arab empires, or Chinese Empire, Mughal Empire. No one cares about that. They only care about white empires, European empires. Now, why is that? Well, I interpret this as this selection as a symptom of the fact that this assault on the record of European empires is an assault on the record of the West. And that's why I as I make clear at the beginning of the book, that's why I chose to write the book, to defend the record of the West, because I think the West, for all its faults, is worth believing in, and certainly now worth defending against totalitarian, ruthless enemies such as Putin and President Xi in China. But I think that's why it's the focus. It's not just that it's modern; it's that the British Empire is Western. And my book has the title Colonialism, and I decided early on, I couldn't possibly cover the whole of the history of every empire, and there's more than enough to be going on with in the British Empire. But the British Empire was the largest and the greatest and most widespread of the European empires, and it was also before the advent of the United States into the status of a world power. It was, as it were, the leading power of the West.
Inevitably, when we discuss the British Empire, slavery is mentioned, because it was a key part, certainly, of the first sort of half of the empire. But then it was also involved in the second half in a slightly different way, in that the empire was seeking to end slavery. But I wanted to ask, because in the book you describe slavery brilliantly, really, because the horrors of slavery are included in the pages of your book. And I mean, I studied 18th century English and European history for A-level, quite unusually, I think. And I never learnt about the slave trade. I learnt about the 7 Years' War and us duffing it up with the French, often coming off on the best. Apologies to my French listeners there. They're used to it, though. The slave trade didn't get a look in on my Oxford and Cambridge, I think, was the examining board in the curriculum, and this was in the 90s. But your description is very powerful of the horrors of slavery, and I don't think you would be averse at all to its inclusion, which it now is, in the curriculum. And that's one of the things that I was reading whilst reading your book. Just I wanted to mention the fact that it provides that balance. This is not an apology by any means.
Yeah. So I'm interested to hear your own testimony, Oliver, about what you didn't read about in school or university, because I can't remember when it was I first read about slavery. Certainly I read about the abolition movement and my implication about slavery when I was very young. So I've always been a bit skeptical as to the claim that no one in Britain knows about slavery.
I knew about slavery. I just didn't. I didn't know I don't think it
details. Yeah.
Well, mate. I mean, but I don't want to, because I had a very good history teacher, so I don't want to cast aspersions to his motivation.
Well, to be fair, there's a hell of a lot of history. I mean, as a school teacher, you can't cover it all. But just in terms of what do I think about the new emphasis on the history of slavery in, let's say, school curricula? Well, I think it's perfectly fair. My worry is that school kids will learn about the appalling British involvement in slave trade and slavery, but not about the fact that Britain was among the earliest states in the history of the world to abolish the slave trade, and then to spend 150 years suppressing it all over the world. Because I mean, the mantra that's been dominant for the last 24 months is colonialism and slavery, as if colonialism and slavery were the same thing. And certainly I've noticed that those who want us to remember what we were up to 220 years ago or 200 years ago never mention what happened from 1807 onwards. So provided school kids get both the horrors of slavery and the admirable 50-year-long campaign to abolish it, which was successful, and then learn that the British Empire was committed to anti-slavery from 1807 until its demise 150 years later. If they get both sides, I'd be perfectly happy.
The fight to end slavery across the Atlantic, particularly with the West Africa Squadron, is a fascinating story. And what I was interested in reading in your book describing the financial cost that there was, because there is a big argument at the moment around reparations, which is obviously a complicated matter. But the financial cost of the British Empire in attempting to stop slavery is significant, and you mentioned figures in your book. But also, there does seem as though we need to explore a little bit more what the financial benefits or maybe even the costs of slavery as well. So it's an interesting balance that you provide in your book on that level.
Yes. So starting with the classic Marxist account of Eric Williams in 1940 in Capitalism and Slavery, there has been the argument that profits from the slave trade and slavery made a major contribution to Britain's Industrial Revolution and subsequent prosperity and global power. Now, I depend entirely on what I read in other historians, but I've read a number of specialists on slavery, including several economic historians, and the doyen, or one of the doyens of the history of abolition, an American historian, David Bryan Davis, pronounced in 2010 that Williams' thesis had been widely discredited. You will still find some who hold it. They tend to be Marxists. But as I explain in the book on the chapter in economics of my book, apart from the fact I'm not a Marxist, but I observe that those who have studied the history of the economics of colonialism and of post-colonial societies generally find that Marxist economics owes a whole lot more to Marxist theory than it does to historical data, and it does not come off well when it confronts historical data. So that's one, as it were, economic issue in the discussion of slavery. And then yes, yes, we clearly money was made out of slavery and the slave trade, but not, I think, it didn't contribute decisively to Britain's industrial takeoff. There were other factors that did that. I think it was David Eltis calculated that in a period roughly between 1807 and 67, there about 50-year period, that as much was spent on suppressing the transatlantic slave trade as had been won in profits from the previous 50 years of slaving, and that's only suppressing the slave trade across the Atlantic. The British went on to spend resources of money and people suppressing the trade and the institution across Africa, India, and Malaysia. Yeah, and for what it's worth, to American political scientists, Robert Pape and Chaim Kaufman concluded that the suppression of the Atlantic slave trade alone was one of the most expensive moral international endeavors in modern history.
It's a fascinating period of history that, you know, when you go from participant to completely fighting against slavery, it's fascinating in itself. I wanted to talk a little bit about, you mentioned at the beginning, and I was really interested in this because you talked about the empire being a source of both pride and shame, and I'm really interested in this question because I myself, speaking very personally here, I feel neither shame, but I don't feel pride either, in that, to me, what took place so far in the past by people that I'm not familiar with, I don't feel either pride or shame. And I wondered whether that's because, you know, I read a lot of history books, so I'm inevitably slightly detached from one period of history to another. You know, they're all different periods of history. And I know, being British, I should have a connection. And I do. I mean, I admire figures from history, but pride or shame, I don't feel about the British Empire. I feel like it happened because it was an empire.
Yeah. I guess that's interesting, and I've heard other people say that to me as well. So when you look back at Britain's past, do you feel proud or shame about anything?
I admire people. So, for example, Winston Churchill, I admire him. There'll be other figures going further back, Wellington and those types of, but I wouldn't say I'm proud of them. Maybe Churchill slightly differently because he's a little bit more recent. Because he's more famous abroad as well, perhaps. But even then, I'd struggle to say I'm proud of him.
Yeah, okay. So I'm willing to put aside pride and shame. I mean, I guess that's perhaps an indication of just how closely I identify myself as British. So I tend to own whatever happened in our recent past, either for worse or for better.
Well, I'm wondering if it's a failing of mine now, you see.
Maybe it is. Or maybe I identify too closely. But okay, it could be a failing of yours, I don't know. But let me put those terms aside and say, yes, admire is an alternative to pride. So I admire Churchill's risky decision to keep us in the war against Hitler in 1940. I admire the fact that he wagered the future of Britain and the empire on that gamble. It was a risky one. He could have failed. It was right that he took that decision, and thank goodness we did prevail. Likewise, I admire the abolitionists, and am I ashamed of the slavers of the 1700s? Well, no, because I don't identify myself with them, but I lament the fact that people in this country did such things.
I would agree with
lament
you.
and admiration would be perhaps a better pair of words than pride and shame, because yes, you're right, neither you nor I are responsible for the good things our ancestors did, nor the bad things, but nevertheless, I think it's, if we identify ourselves as British, yes, if you identify yourself as with anything, well, because there are strong and weak forms of identification. You could say, well, I'm British just because I've got a passport, but frankly, I could just as happily spend my life in Hong Kong or New York. That's a pretty weak sense of identification. If you identify yourself more strongly, then it's because you find something in the idea of Britain, or the institutions of Britain, or the history of Britain, that you find admirable, and you want to identify yourself with it. And I'm that kind of Briton.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. It's just, I think when you mention slavers and I feel so disconnected from them, it would be difficult to be emotional. So I'm glad you mentioned Churchill during the Second World War, which is probably, I mean, the British Empire's, as you say in your book, it's when the British Empire is probably most violent. It is probably the crowning achievement of the British Empire in defeating both Japan and Germany.
With a little help from America. Don't want to miss them out.
So I don't think there's any doubt about that. But I was very interested. Do you think that this is something that is overlooked by many, in that it's sort of Britain alone, and we forget about the contribution of the empire?
Yeah, I think we did for a long time. Certainly all the war movies I saw as a kid in the 50s and 60s, all the British people were white, as far as I remember. But you may know that there is now a memorial around the northwest corner of Green Park in London. There are a set of war memorials. There's an Australian one, there's a New Zealand one, and just near there's also one to, I forget how it's described, but in effect to Indian and African and West Indian contributions to the imperial effort during the Second World War. And I rather worried at one point that the latter, this last memorial, had been a kind of afterthought. And I was very pleasantly surprised to discover that was actually erected before the Australian one. but we're talking around 20 years ago. So I think you're right that there had been a neglect of the imperial dimension of the war. I guess I'd known about it for some long time, because my father fought in Italy and mentioned at one point that Americans mistook him for an Indian. because he'd been so blackened by the sun, and the Indian division was just to his right. So I was aware that Indian people were fighting not just in Burma but also in Europe.
Well, over 2 million. We've had Robert Lyman on the podcast, and over 2 million.
Yeah.
I think about 2.5 million Indians volunteered to fight during the Second World War.
And yes, I was in communication with Robert before I published my book, and from what he wrote, it's quite a subtle point. I mean, they volunteered to fight with the British against the Japanese. No, they didn't want the British to stay ruling them forever. But what they did want to do is to rule themselves through the institutions that the British have built. And they did not want the Japanese to take that over or dismantle it. So there's as it were, a limited tribute to the British there.
Now, one area of colonialism that I think I'd be keen to talk with you about is famine. And in particular, there are two, one close to home, Ireland, the famine of 1846 to 1850. And then during the Second World War in Bengal as well. Yeah. Now, the famine in Ireland, and indeed the famine with Bengal, I don't think anyone seriously believes that they were intentional in any way. However,
some Irish nationalists talk of them as being genocide, but they're an extreme.
Yes. I don't think any serious historians would think that. But it does suggest that there is, when one country is ruling another country, there can be a neglect resulting in a famine. And do you think that famine is particularly more likely? I mean, with Ireland, there are a number of complicating factors, so I do get that it's probably a slightly simplistic question.
Well, let's take India first of all, because the famous economist Amartya Sen put forward the thesis that where you have democracy, you don't have famine. So because the British Empire was not democratic, that's why you had famine. And I think the logic is that democracy communicates distress from the bottom to the top faster, and through democratic agitation and the press, government is forced to respond more fully and more swiftly. But there are problems with that thesis. In India, there were a number of severe famines in the late 19th century, some of which were dealt with. The response was prompt and efficient, some of which the response was totally inadequate. Titankar Roy, the economic historian at the LSE, reckons that throughout the late 19th century, British officials learnt from their mistakes. So no one intended famine. Sometimes the response was inadequate for a variety of reasons, some of which, some mistakes are honest, some mistakes are culpable. But he argues that the British studied and learnt from their mistakes, so that by 1900, partly through the development of a railway network, which among other things served to bring relief more quickly to famine-stricken areas, he reckons that famine as a regular occurrence had been dealt with. So there's that. But also in terms of Bengal, Sen's thesis hits the rocks partly because the Bengal famine happened in 1943, and since the mid-1930s, the government of the province of Bengal, or whatever the Bengal was called then, the state of Bengal, was a democratically elected Indian government. Now, the causes of the famine, or the failure to relieve the famine, highly controversial. There was, I think, a problem of divided responsibility between the imperial government and the provincial government that was partly the cause. But it wasn't, as it were, the lack of awareness at the top that there was trouble, nor was it that Brits were tin-eared to the distress of Indians, because the provincial government of India was run by Indians. And there's also a dispute as to whether the problem was actually lack of quantity of supply of food, or, as others think, a problem of distribution of an adequate supply. So Churchill gets blamed because he didn't immediately allow the diversion of shipping to transport food to Bengal. And some people say this because he was a racist. There's no evidence of that. I mean, whatever Churchill's general views on non-white peoples was, in this case, there's no evidence that it was racial prejudice that made him make the decision. The real reason was that the Allies, having just booted Rommel out of North Africa, were planning to invade, for the first time, to invade mainland Europe through Sicily. And shipping was scarce. And in order to carry through that plan, they needed all the shipping they could get. That's why Churchill did not immediately divert shipping to Bengal, in addition to the fact that there was some dispute as to whether the problem was lack of supply at all. And I think there's good reason to suppose it wasn't lack of supply, it was internal distribution that was the problem. No, I think I, along with Tirthankar Roy, the historian I mentioned earlier, I think we don't think the empire was, that as it were, that imperial government in India was the cause of famine. As for Ireland, it's a different case. No one seriously thinks that, no one sensible thinks the British seriously intended genocide. There are perhaps legitimate claims that the government was too niggardly in its response. Yes, there were shipments of grain leaving Ireland during the famine, but Roy Foster, the leading historian of modern Ireland, says that really didn't account for much, and there was plenty of stuff coming in at the same time. Interestingly, Irish nationalists sometimes repudiated offers of help from England because they didn't want Ireland to become dependent on England. So there were failings in dealing with the famine. To what extent those failings were culpable, I think, is a moot question, because 19th century governments, we need to remember, were very limited in resources and power, nothing like the power that a modern British state has right now. So whether they could have done more and should have done more or done differently is a controversial question that remains controversial.
It does indeed. Overall, I think towards the end of the book, you balance up both positive and negative. And so I suppose the big question is, in the final analysis, do you view the British Empire as a positive impact on the world or a negative one?
Yes. So you're right at the end. I do draw up a debit and credit column. So on the debit column, you've got the usually inadvertent spread of disease. You've got disproportionate violence. You've got a failure to admit native people to the top echelons of government until the very end. You've got slavery. On the credit column, you've got anti-slavery. You've got the suppression of intertribal violence. You've got spread of modern medicine. You've got stable government, rule of law, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so you've got two columns. And I say, and I've always held this, you've got a different sets of evils and goods. You've got chalk and cheese. You can't say sensibly, okay, this quantity of the spread of modern medicine was worth that quantity of excessive violence. It doesn't make sense. So like any state, the British imperial state presided over good and bad things. So how do we reach a judgment? So what I say is this: well, one way to reach it is to say that there was something at the center of the imperial system that was evil. And so it doesn't matter how many railways the British built, or how many people modern medicine spread by the British saved. At its heart, the empire was racist, or at its heart, it was all about economic exploitation. And that's the reason I think that there was such a violent reaction to my moderate claim that the British can find good things as well as bad in their empire 5 years ago, is because the line that has been peddled among us by a noisy, shouty, anti-colonialist left wing is that the British Empire was equivalent to Nazism. So it doesn't matter what good stuff it did. At its heart, it was nasty and racist and exploitative and violent. And insofar as we venerate it, insofar as people like Biggar venerate it, admire it, we represent the kind of racist, white supremacist attitudes that were at the heart of colonialism. And so in order to combat the systemic racism that infects us now, we have to repudiate the whole of that history. But the reason we do it is because essentially, the British Empire was Nazi and committed genocide and whatever. And so in the book, I examine that question and I come to the conclusion there was nothing in the British Empire that approximated Nazism. Nothing. Not even, there was no intentional genocide anywhere. I mean, there were, for example, in Tasmania, there were individual settlers who were intent on exterminating natives. But even then, I don't think the majority of settlers were not of that mind, and the colonial government certainly was not of that mind. And General Kitchener's concentration camps in the Second Anglo-Boer War in 1900 had nothing to do with Auschwitz. Anyway, I could go on. So there was nothing equivalent to the crazed, massively murderous, racist heart of Nazi Germany in the British Empire. So that's one thing. So let's put that aside. And then I say there were significant humanitarian and liberal endeavors close to the heart of the empire. I've mentioned the anti-slavery commitment for 150 years. There was also a liberal political commitment. So the British learnt from the American War of Independence that the empire couldn't keep tight control over its distant, far-flung parts. And that's why from 1867 onwards, the so-called white dominions of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa become increasingly independent. And by 1930, they're virtually independent states. And after the First World War, India was set on the same track. And you'll find in the 1820s, the three Scottish governors of Calcutta, Madras, and Bombay, all three of them say, look, folks, we can't be here forever. The most we can do is help establish half-decent government in India, and then leave with grace and hopefully with the affection of the Indians. They said that way back in the 1820s. So there was a liberal strand, a humanitarian strand, and the other thing is the empire learned from its mistakes. So that's why I think the way in which the empire exhausted itself in the Second World War is a kind of, says a lot that the way the empire died, or exhausted itself before it died, was to spend itself fighting Nazism. And Marjorie Perham, the expert on colonialism in Africa, who flourished around 1950s, 60s, she said that the story of the British in Africa is a story of increasing virtue.
I think one thing I've been struck since being introduced to the whole history world, which is alien to me from my studying the subject up to degree level, which is applying today's values to the past. There's, of course, that great quote, the past is a foreign country.
Yes.
And I'm assuming this is something that this is a worrying development in the world of history.
Yes, and I find it's quite prevalent. It's quite prevalent. So I was talking to someone yesterday for another podcast. He was in Canada, and he was, we were talking about the introduction by the British of a cash economy, and the implication that this was, this capitalist industrialist economy. And I said, well, I'm not entirely sure what's wrong with that. He said, well, no, there's nothing wrong with it, just provided you have workers' rights and insurance and guarantees and minimal conditions of work and all the array of legal rights and protections that we now in the early 21st century in the Western world expect. And I said, well, yeah, but it took us a long time to get here. When we started off with the Industrial Revolution, we had a feudal system. There was a system whereby the wealthier contributed to taking care of the poor in their rural districts, but that got completely overwhelmed by urbanization, industrialization. It took us a long time to work out how to limit and control the inhumane effects of certain industrial arrangements. So there's a strange, to me, just a strange lack of awareness that the world that you and I inhabit in Britain or Canada, Australia, or in the Western world certainly, is extraordinarily privileged in terms of, generally speaking, in terms of wealth, health, security, prosperity. And if you've read history, you will know this is not usual. I mean, please God, it will stay this way, but I don't think we can be 100% confident it will. But it took a lot of building. A lot of people, parts of the world do not enjoy it, our conditions. And so it's just seems to me stupid, or if I'm going to be less provocative, completely lacking in historical imagination to realize just how different circumstances were. So the one case where I try and explain this is that, no, of course, one should never use, I mean, I'm not a pacifist. I think sometimes one has to use violence to stop great evil and to protect the innocent. But even so, one should never use more violence than one really has to. And given an extraordinarily strong state, and given the extraordinary stability we usually enjoy in contemporary Britain, the use of force by the police can be very restrained. It is constrained, and rightly so. But if you put yourself in a position where the state is not so strong, where it is fragile, where with the threat of the state dissolving and society being plunged into anarchy, where you get ruled by warlords, then if you want to stop that, the quantity of violence you have to use and the risks you have to take in using it are much higher and justifiably higher. So you've got to get yourself out of where we are now and put yourself into a very different situation if you're going to judge it rightly. So I think one needs to, what moral principles require does vary according to circumstance. And so when you're judging the past, you've got to understand the circumstances rightly.
That reminds me of something I was reading in a book on medieval history, where a father sells his child into slavery, which on the face of it is a terrible moral decision. But if that father is facing starvation, or that family is facing starvation, and the only way the child can survive is to be sold into slavery in the medieval period, then that becomes a morally acceptable decision. And it's really an awareness of what people went through in the past. That
exactly. And even today, people in some parts of the world, maybe even in our own society, their lives are very constrained and their choices are very constrained, and some choices they have to make are awful. And before we judge, we need to open our eyes to that. Otherwise, we end up being moralistic.
Well, Nigel, this has been a real pleasure speaking to you. Thank you very much for your time. The book, Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning, best of luck with it. It's going well so far, so let's hope I really hope it continues to do so. And thank you again.
Thanks, Oliver, for this chance. It's been good to talk to you, and you've raised some really interesting questions that keep me chewing over for quite a while.
Thank you so much for listening. I do hope you found that interesting. You can get in touch with me either way. I'd be very happy to hear from you. If you like the podcast, please do subscribe. You'll get upcoming episodes in your feed. On Tuesday, I'm starting the Aspects of History Film Club with friend of the show, Director Tim Hewitt. First film is Lincoln, directed by Steven Spielberg and starring Daniel Day-Lewis and Sally Field. Next Saturday, I have Ian Mortimer talking about the Middle Ages. Then I've got John Sayles on 18th century Scotland and America. And then Anthony Selden talking about walking along the Western Front. I've got some ancient history coming up too, and in March, our film of the month will be the Iran Revolution movie Argo, directed by Ben Affleck and starring him and Bryan Cranston, so I do hope you can join me. Until then, thank you and good night.